meeting of the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. We are pleased to be able to welcome our members, our partners, our friends, including those who have been with us for a while, as well as our new members. We do have interpretation available for the entire 3 days of the meeting in both French and in Spanish. So for those of you who would like to make use of this feature, you may join the appropriate room by clicking on the globe or interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and choosing which language you prefer. We do have a wonderful team of interpreters assisting us for this 3-day meeting, and I would like to thank them for supporting us. And also then a brief reminder to those presenting and to those participating in discussions to speak slowly in consideration of our interpreters. So let's get started with a few housekeeping items. First, please introduce yourself using the chat feature and include your name, organization, and location. This is essential for recording participation in the meeting since we don't have a way to do that otherwise. We don't have a registration system. And we hope that you will do this each day of the meeting so that we can more accurately capture participation. My sincere gratitude for your cooperation on this. The Washington Group Secretariat is often asked who attends our meetings, who participates with us, and so having you put your introduction in the chat is very helpful. Next, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. We do expect a large number of attendees, which can create background noise. So please turn your microphone and your camera off when not speaking. Item number 3 is about using the chat to post thoughts, questions, and other interventions throughout the meeting. This is a working meeting, and your participation is essential for both dialogue and decision-making. There will also be polls in some of the sessions where we're going to release some questions concerning either next steps or to gather your inputs on other issues such as decision-making and other points related to the topic at that time. So in some sessions, we'll have polls as well. And finally, this meeting is being recorded. We hope that this is agreeable to all of you. That way, those who cannot join will be able to share in the content of the meeting when the recording is posted to the website. Before we begin, we want to express our gratitude to the 2 organizations who are supporting the interpretation services. The Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and CBM Global Disability Inclusion have contributed to make both French and the Spanish channels available. We also want to thank those who have helped shape this agenda for the meeting. The Washington Group Steering Committee and a subcommittee of dedicated volunteers, Elena De Palma, Riaza Fatima, and Nicolas Petrovsky, for their time and their ideas. And to the many who will participate in this 23rd meeting, thank you for your time and contributions over the next 3 days. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to begin our first session. Jennifer Maddens, Chair of the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. Jennifer.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning, everybody. Is there an echo? Can you hear me? Is there an echo or just?
I don't hear an echo.
Okay, it just must be me. I apologize. The reason we're late is my computer IT issues, and I apologize for that. So welcome as well from me to our 23rd meeting. It's kind of hard to believe we've had 23 meetings. And it is really great to see so many people here. Next slide, please, Julie. We've had 23 meetings and we've kind of organized many of them the same way. We try to have a working meeting, as Julie said, where we kind of share our accomplishments since the last meeting. And where we think about what we want to do moving forward. We will hear from our regional groups, which have become a major activity for us. And also hear updates on the work group activities and on the development of disability tools that they've been undertaking. Our main goal is to develop next year's work plan and agree on activities for that.
Right.
We need you to contribute to the decision-making as part of these discussions. Please put things in the chat, raise your hand, answer the poll questions, and then there will also be follow-up emails from the Secretariat to get your info. So please respond to those. It's very lonely when no one responds to our emails, so please respond. Next slide, please. So the meeting structure is very similar to past years. We will have plenary sessions. These will be, for example, the one we're doing now. There will be updates from the regional groups, from the work groups, and also from some of our partners. There will be a breakout session. This is tomorrow. It is for the regional group meetings. There will be 6 breakouts for the 5 groups plus a non-affiliated country and partner group. As Julie mentioned, we don't have a way to do RSVPs for this meeting. So if we have no idea who is here from which region and how many people will attend those breakouts, if you happen to be in a group that doesn't have a lot of members present and you would prefer not to have that meeting, you can always join the non-affiliated group. And again, we have the polls and the discussion periods throughout the meeting to gather your feedback. Virtual meetings are wonderful, but they are hard to maintain interaction. So we're trying to use this as a way to get everyone who is attending the meeting involved. Next slide, please. So as you know, given the time differences that we're all in, we do have 2 schedules for this. The first one, which we're at today, which is in the morning US time and in the afternoon for many of you, is for 3 days, about 3 hours each day. And then we do another schedule, another meeting, only one day for those who are primarily in the Pacific area where this time frame is not so great for them. You're welcome to join any of these as suits your schedule. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, a session overview. Today, we'll do these updates. We'll then have a work group presentation. This is the evaluation of the child functioning teacher version. It's a more of an informal get together of our partners who are working on this, and we'll get some actual results from the work that they've been doing. We'll then have a session on translations. This is the work group presentation, following up from last week of how do we handle all the requests for translations that the Secretariat gets. And then because we're very interested in, at this meeting, thinking hard about where we want to go, and in past meetings when we met in person, we always would do a little kind of pre-meeting meeting where we went through the history and the tools developed by the Washington group. We're going to have a brief overview and review of the Washington history and where we have been, what we have done. And this is to set the stage for this last session of the meeting in 2 days' time. We will talk about next steps. We want to make sure everyone is on board with the past, especially some of our new members, some of whom probably have never been to an in-person annual meeting and haven't had some of this background information. Tomorrow, we'll get an update on the inclusive education module. We will hear a presentation on development of standard analytic disability reports. We've talked about this before, how to do them, how should we move forward doing them, whether we can develop enough of them so that we can have kind of a major data release at some point in the upcoming future. And then we will have the regional group breakout sessions, and there's no formal closing there. When you're done with your session, you can just leave. We will not be coming back to plenary. Next slide, please. And then on the last day, we will start with a report out from the regional groups on their activities. And we've also, the planning committee for this meeting has asked that they think about how they might go about doing these standard analytic reports so that we can get some traction on that. We will hear back from the mental health and psychosocial working group update on the testing they have been done. And then we will move to a slightly longer session that we normally have, very briefly on the accomplishments and decisions made, but really on next steps. As we go through the next 3 days, think about what you would like the Washington Group to be doing in the next year. What do you need to improve disability statistics in your country or in your or in the work of your organization? And how can the Washington Group help you do that? And what should we do to make that happen? Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a really, really brief overview of some of the work of the Secretariat, really. As I've said before, the Secretariat has become kind of a clearinghouse for information on disability statistics. Sometimes these are direct questions, sometimes they come through third parties. They range from quick questions where we can point someone to the website. Sometimes they involve long discussions. Sometimes they involve reviewing documents to make sure that they're accurate. So we'd like to provide to you with some information about what the Secretariat has been doing. And to my takeaway from this is that there is just a huge uptake of the tools we've all developed over the last 20 odd years. They are being used all over. People are interested in them. They ask us about them, and they show up everywhere. So we just want to give you an idea of what's happening. Next slide, please. Again, our 23rd meeting, our 4th virtual meeting. While virtual meetings are great, we can get a whole lot more people to come than people traveling to someplace. It just changes the nature of the interaction. And that's what we are concerned about, trying to maintain the Secretariat's interaction with members and making sure that the products and the activities are really meeting member needs. And that's much harder in this environment. So we really need your help. Next slide. And so our membership is still quite large. You can see in this slide just how many countries have members. That means that that the head of your statistical organization sends us the name of a person. Whether that person really is engaged is up to them. We would like more engagement from our members, but clearly there is a way for us to communicate with a lot of countries in the world. Next slide, please. The Secretariat goes to a lot of meetings. Sometimes we are participants, sometimes we're just listening. Sometimes we're just there to have, if people have questions. And on this slide, I'm not going to read it, just gives you a list of some of the meetings that the Secretariat has attended to ensure that the Washington Group is available and our voice is heard. Now, we'll mention that last year we did attend the Statistical Commission, but it is this year, the upcoming meeting in March, where we have to present to the Commission. Now, we will be presenting as an informational item. It will not be a discussion item, for those of you who know that distinction. And our work will be included in a broader document that includes work of other UN agencies. That is what has happened in the last 2 or 3 times we've been at the Commission. We will share that document with you. It is basically a review of what's happened since we were at the Commission the last time. And we will also probably prepare a room document that's a little bit longer than we can do in this. Next slide, please. We have had more involved participation in some meetings, for example, COSP, where we would be involved in side events, and also a lot of bilateral conversations with members. And we've provided input, for example, into the Disability and Development Report that the UN put out. Next slide, please. We have a lot of conversations with UN agencies. They're just listed here. Again, some are short, some are long. And often it is to review something that they want to put in one of their reports to make sure it's correct. Next slide, please. We provide some technical assistance as requested from member countries. Again, sometimes very short, sometimes longer, sometimes reviewing documents. And here's a list of some that we have dealt with this year. Next slide, please. And now we have a huge list of NGOs, OPDs, universities, and others that we have provided technical assistance to in some way. And again, not going to go through all of them, but you can see it is a long list, and it's a very varied list. It's a very different kinds of organizations that know about the work of the Washington Group, have contacted us so that we can provide assistance in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. We try to do, and this is really Julie, tries to keep track of where the Washington Group is mentioned, where the work has been mentioned, and how it is referred to. And again, this slide, and I believe the next one, just gives examples of where Washington Group is mentioned. Often it is the Washington Group tool is the recommended tool. That's a very standard kind of comment that we get. Sometimes these are very short, sometimes they're very long mentions, and often people do take from our website, which is absolutely great. Right before this meeting, Julie told me that she actually just did a quick Google on Washington Group and to find things, and there were dozens of references that we didn't know about. So it is even broader than we think. It's almost impossible to keep track of all the places. But it is very encouraging to me anyway, that all the work that we've done for the past 20 odd years is really getting traction. Next slide. Again, requests for information tools for translation, primarily translation. And this is kind of to set the stage for the next talk that I'll be given. The Secretariat gets two kinds of things. They get requests for translations that we have of all of the tools, and we get translations themselves. Those who have worked and done translations in languages we don't have offer us the translation so that we can share it. And so you can see lots of requests and lots of for translations and lots of translations in a lot of different languages. Next slide, please. Again, even more. And you can see the languages here. There's just a huge range in the requests that we get and the translations we receive. We are in a point where we can't handle this in our current process. So we have a proposal, you'll hear it later today, about how to modify the process so everyone can get what they need and it's just not so overwhelming for the Secretariat. Next slide, please. And then we have been providing a lot of support as much as we can as a Secretariat to the regional groups, and we have been able to get financial support. This is the only financial support the Washington Group has right now from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, who have agreed to support the two regional disability statistics group in Africa, the Brazzaville group and the Southern and Eastern African group. These grants are administered by UCL, who's been our partner in this for quite some time. And they are, again, are supporting the interpretation for French in this meeting. And you saw that CBM Global was supporting the translation for Spanish. We had the first grant went from 15 September 2021 to 30 June 2023. That one was over. The second one is going from the beginning of August 2023 through July 2025. That's an important date because, as you'll hear, the World Disability Summit which is hosted by Germany and Jordan, I believe, will be held in Berlin in 2025, and we want to do some preparation work for that. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you all for reporting to the request that we send out for the country report forms. We send these every year in preparation for the meeting. Thank you all for sending back your responses. Anyone who hasn't, we are still accepting them, so there's time. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where we got the country reports from. It's a pretty good sprinkling around the world. Again, there were 64 reports. We'd like to fill in some of the empty spaces here. So please send in your report as soon as you can. Next slide. And one of the things we always ask is, where is the short set, particularly the short set, being used now? This is a question that we get all the time. How many countries are using the short set? It's getting a little complicated to keep track of this because with the passage of time, multiple census rounds, multiple other kinds of data collections, the questions are used more continuously, so we don't have unique uses. So this is based on data from reports from 2009 to 23 from the annual submission. And we have 123 listings. Some of these are, multiple in the same country, but clearly we're getting wide use of the tool throughout the world. Next slide, please. And then we know that there will be more data collections in 2024. Some of these are censuses, some of these are other kinds of data collection, and we should have another 29 of uses of the Washington Group. Next slide. Now we also ask you about your use of the tools, your data collection, in other ways. So for example, standalone surveys, that has been a topic of interest. Now, many of these do include the basic tool, but go beyond. And 18 of the 64 countries reported that they will carry out a standalone survey or have, and will do this in the near future, and we've listed those here. We have tried to get a work group going on standalone surveys. It hasn't been very successful, but I asked the countries that are listed here if they would like to join kind of an informal group to share their experiences with their standalone surveys. I think that might be very useful. 28 of the countries are having a disability module within another survey. Again, these often include Washington Group tools, but they go beyond that. And the other kind of big issue is the use of administrative data to collect disability statistics. 48 of the 64 surveys say that they do collect some kind of disability data in administrative records. And this is a particularly challenging way to collect data because of the way it is done. As you know, we have some best practices and some blogs on how to do this, but it certainly is coming up as an important area. And the things you'll hear about the CFMTV, which can be used as part of an administrative system. I think this is just going to grow, and we're going to have to figure out how to pull together data from administrative and survey systems in a way. And while COVID is beginning to fade, we do ask about COVID-19 related data collections, and a few countries reported that this was still going on. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it for me. I'm sorry I had to having these technical difficulties, which make this a little confusing, but I want to thank you all again for coming. I want to thank the steering committee for supporting the development of all of this work, the work group chairs and members, All of our work is done through our work groups. We really wouldn't have anything without you. The regional group chairs have just been doing fantastic work to really push development in their areas, and all the members of the interest groups and all of our partners who have joined us on this journey. It makes it much more enjoyable and also much more impactful to have all of you with us. So I'm going to hand it back over to Julie. My problem is I can't hear anything. So if you have any questions, and I think we're probably running a little bit late, maybe we can deal with them at some future time when maybe I can hear you. Does that work, Julie?
Yes, yes, it does. Yes. Thank you all. Thank you, Jennifer. We are going to move right into session 2. Session 2 is about the child functioning module teacher version. And the idea here is that you have heard before that we are acting as a clearinghouse for a number of partners who are doing their evaluations as part of their own programmatic work in different places. We are inviting them to join us today to talk a little bit about some of the early findings that they are seeing from those evaluations. But first, let me take a step back and walk you through how we got here and give, especially for those who are new to this, some background information. So this group was convened in 2021. The Secretariat was certainly noticing that we were getting quite a few stakeholders reaching out to us who were either planning or already undertaking some kind of evaluation of the teacher version of the child functioning module in their programs. What we did as a result of that was start to have meetings where we just kind of got together and heard about the projects, and many of them were in very different stages, but for the most part, we were hearing about all of this work pretty much in a very compressed time period. And so we started meeting regularly. Our last meeting was just last month in September, and the following organizations have been participating in the meetings, and there are a few others that are not listed here. This is a project overview of some of the things that are going on. What I want to call your attention to is that we have a number of organizations from UNICEF to Humanity and Inclusion, Education Cannot Wait, Save the Children, Norway and International, and Site Savers, USAID, and School to School International. And the project dates, as you can see, are pretty much all in the same range. Some of them have completed their evaluations or are very close to doing so, and others will go into 2024. The locations for these projects vary. They are listed here. Generally speaking, they go from very small to a group of maybe 5 to 10 schools in a very particular province of a particular region, up to 58 schools. USAID did their project, which has ended, and their results on the web have quite a few schools in their program. The evaluation details vary somewhat, but what's interesting is they all tend to involve a very mixed methods approach. So many of them have a qualitative component where they're doing cognitive interviewing or focus groups with teachers to ask about their knowledge of the subject, or in a debriefing kind of way, asking what they got out of the project, what their interpretations of the project were. Many of them also involve quantitative methods of both the school-based and the in-home collections. So So there are, a lot of these reports will include analyses, and you'll hear about some of those as we go forward. And many of them to look at inter and intra-rater components included, for example, an interview with the teacher administering the child functioning module teacher version, but also a caregiver, often a parent. And there they administered the child functioning module itself. So some of these evaluations include a component where they are looking at agreement between what a teacher reports about a student and what a caregiver reports about that child. We have a panel today who are going to tell us a little bit about the projects and some of the early findings. As I mentioned, we're going to have Claudia Kappa from UNICEF, Aud Bruce from Humanity Inclusion, Henok Zeraichen from Save the Children Norway, Julia Ducat from Sight Savers, Anne Lasecki from School to School International, and Rebecca Poggle from USAID. And I'm going to not introduce them in between their presentations, so I wanted to do so here. We asked the panel 3 basic questions. So just to remind everyone, the testing objective of this teacher version is such that it should provide evidence for the key question, not whether the questions work, because we've already done a fair amount of testing of these child functioning questions, but whether teachers are credible informants using the answer categories provided in the instrument, and the extent to which their credibility varies by functioning domain or as a function of characteristics of the school or the classroom or the teacher or some combination of these factors. So in the presentations today, you'll hear some responses to, do the evaluation results differ by functional domains? Are we seeing differences in terms of either agreement or what a teacher knows to some domains of functioning versus others? The second question we posed is, does the quality of the teacher response vary? And if so, in what ways? So are there characteristics of the teacher, of the school or the classroom, or something else that maybe we can't anticipate a priori that influences the quality of the responses that we get from teachers? And finally, the third question is, did administering the CFMTV have any unintended impacts on teacher awareness of disability? So in going through this exercise and asking teachers to assess students in a way that many of them have never had to do. So when we ask these questions that are part of the teacher version, the experience of doing that may have impacted teachers' own beliefs or thoughts or interactions or behaviors in the classroom. And so if there are any of those unintended consequences, we ask the presenters to reflect on those as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn over the audio to Claudia Kappa from UNICEF, and I also am going to give you control of the screen, Claudia, if you'll give me just a minute. Are you able to take control now?
No.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to do it for you. I apologize.
I just sent you a request.
There you go.
Right now to take control. Thank you. I hope I'm going to be able to change it. Let me quickly see. Yes. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to join this annual meeting of the Washington Group to share some information about the methodological work we have conducted in two sites, Kosovo, as per the UN resolution of the Security Council 1244, and Malawi. In both sites, we had an opportunity to visit a total of 140 schools, 120 in Malawi and 20 in Kosovo. Going forward, I will refer to Kosovo as such, with the understanding that, again, we are relating to Kosovo as per the UN Security Council Resolution 1244. A total of 2,183 students were surveyed as part of these two methodological exercises, with, of course, a larger sample in the case of Kosovo, where 20 schools were sampled. Now, in response to the question that Julie shared with us, do results of the evaluation vary by domain? It was very clear after the field work that we did that indeed the responses provided by parents and teachers on the same children were largely in agreement. But I wanted to specify how we consider agreement, because of course we know very well that when it comes to the child functioning module, the recommended cutoff that was decided by UNICEF and the Washington Group includes children who cannot perform at all for each one of the domains of functioning, or have a lot of difficulty in the different domains. So that's where the cutoff was set. Of course, there are children for which the mother or primary caregiver report some level of difficulty, but these children are not included in the cutoff that was finally decided to be used for international reporting when it comes to the standard child functioning module. Now, in the case of these exercises we conducted, we wanted to check the level of agreement between teachers and mothers or primary caregivers across the different domains, considering, obviously, all the four different response categories. So no difficulty, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, and cannot do at all. As you can see from this slide, what we found from the testing conducted in these two sites is that the overall level of disagreement, meaning the mother or primary caregiver report a level of difficulty that does not match the level of difficulty reported by the teacher, tend to be very low when it comes to hearing, walking, all the way, I would say, to seeing, where less than 25% of cases there is a disagreement. Now, this includes, again, hearing, walking, making friends, controlling behavior, accepting change, concentrating, learning, remembering, and seeing. Now, when it comes to other domains like depression and anxiety, as well as communication, the level of disagreement between the mothers or primary caregivers and the teachers tend to be a little bit higher. But of course, we also have to consider that the level of disagreement tend to be higher in these three domains, and particularly in the case of communication, considering also the SAM category in the response scale. And let me explain a little bit better what I mean by that. So this is the level of agreement when it comes to the three categories of no functional difficulty, some functional difficulty, and the third category of a lot of functional difficulty, cannot do at all. So in this case, we're using three groupings. Yeah? In this case, that's the slide that I presented earlier. The level of disagreements tend to be 59.5% overall, which is mainly driven by the level of disagreement in the area of communication, anxiety, and depression. However, when we use the standard two groupings, meaning in a lot of difficulty and cannot do at all, versus no difficulty and some difficulty, which is the standard categorization that it's recommended by UNICEF and the Washington Group, we can see that the level of disagreement dropped significantly. Overall, almost 90% of cases, there is agreement between the mother or primary caregiver and the teacher. So the level of disagreement is 11%. And if we look at this across domain, again, when we use this dichotomy, the level of disagreement between the mother or primary caregiver and the teacher is less than 5%. So this was obviously reassuring, because if we go for the standard approach, the level of disagreement between teachers and mothers or primary caregivers tends to be very low. Now, the second question was, did the level of agreement vary by the characteristics of the teacher, the classroom, or their school? And in this case, we ran a series of logistic regressions to check the overall level of agreement. These are preliminary results, and of course, I don't expect that you will be able to quickly grasp this level of these results, but just to say that there was some significance in terms of relating to the level of disagreement depending on the sex of the child and the grade of the child. When it comes to the overall level of disagreement, variables related to the parent or primary caregiver, as well as the teacher or the school, did not seem to be significant when it comes to the total level of disagreement. Now, things look very different when we run the logistic regressions considering the different domains. So, and here again, as you can see in red, these are the results that obviously indicate that there is a level of significance with the different levels indicated here. When it comes to looking at the domain, for example, it looks like, for example, teachers who are better, more familiar with the students might have higher level of disagreement, particularly when it comes to the domains where we expect such disagreement to be evident. Like, for example, learning, remembering, concentrating, and to some extent accepting change and controlling behavior. This seems to be linked to the relationship, or at least the level of familiarity between the teacher and the students. Did administering the CFM-TV have an intended impact on teacher awareness of disability? That was a very interesting finding in itself, because this is mostly related to the qualitative feedback that we gathered during the field work. First of all, indeed, it seems like parents had an easier time responding to questions related to the sensory and physical domain. They responded more easily and quickly. When it comes to teachers, teachers had less trouble responding, or at least indicating promptly a response when it comes to the domain related to learning, remembering, and concentrating. This is where they felt more comfortable. There were less hesitation in terms of responding. The second thing that we noticed is that, particularly in the case of Malawi, we administered the questionnaire to two separate groups of teachers. One group had received training about the child functioning module and the overall approach behind the child functioning module in terms of defining and measuring disability, and a second group of teachers did not. Well, teachers who did receive this training responded quicker to the interview and felt like it was easier for them to respond to this questionnaire, again, as part of the feedback that was gathered through interviews between the teachers and the field team at the end of the process. So indeed, it seems like the training on the CFM helped the teacher respond to the questionnaire, but overall, they also indicated that they felt that the training and the administration of the module was more useful to them. They finally had an opportunity to look at their children and their students with a more with a specific lens, with a renewed lens. So indeed, the training seemed to help teacher approach the questionnaire, the feeling of the questionnaire in a certain way, but also help teacher know that, look at their children, their students a little bit better. In terms of overall administration, in the case of Malawi, we tested the administration of the CFM through an interview, as well as a self-administered questionnaire that teachers need to fill out. And we noticed that the self-administration of the questionnaire was not as successful. Teachers took longer. The number of questionnaires that were complete was incomplete, or missing responses was higher. So it seems like the self-administration of the questionnaire created a little bit more trouble for teachers. Now, in terms of very quickly of the next steps, we plan to host a technical consultation, bringing together also the other partners that, as Julie mentioned earlier, have done specific methodological work on this topic. So we hope to host this consultation in March 2024. By then, most of these field tests will be completed across the different partners. So we would like to invite them to come to New York and come together to review jointly the results of the field test of the child functioning module teacher version. Because ultimately what we want to issue are guidelines of how to use the CFM-TV, under which conditions it can work well, under which it could not, and to be able then to finally release the module in June 2024. And when I say releasing the module, of course, the CFM-TV is already in the public domain to a large extent, but to release the official version of the module together with the accompanying guidelines that explain how to use the module in this specific context. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answer any question you might have. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I will continue the presentation. So my name is Aude Bruce. I work for NGO, Humanity and Inclusion, as research specialist. So Humanity and Inclusion is working with and for persons with disabilities and other vulnerable population to improve their living condition. And of course, as a disability-focused organization, we are also interested in the process to generate disability data. We have a lot of internal discussion around tools and processes, procedures. So that's why I'm here to present the findings we get for research we have done in Uganda to explore how the CFM work in a very specific context. Next slide, please. So what is important here in terms of goal is to understand that this testing was implemented in emergency and protected crisis. It's important to keep it in mind. And we wanted also to test the CFM-TV for programmatic purposes. So we're really at the project level as an NGO to try to improve our monitoring of the project we are implementing. So we had different objectives. The idea was first to explore the comprehensibility of the CFM-TV by the teacher. Then we tried to understand, to explore the reliability of the CFM-TV with different kinds of surveys. So the first one was to analyze the stability of the assessment by the same teacher through times. So the same teacher assessed twice learners of their classroom, and we compare the results. And we wanted also to compare the assessment of the teacher, as the UNICEF did before, with the caregiver reporting. And then we get also some insight on the feasibility and practicability of the CFM-TV in real situation at school level, collecting the feedback from the teachers. Next slide, please. So just very quickly about the research, we implemented it in Uganda in one settlement in Chakatu. Our target, it was more primary schools with teaching from P1 to P7 and covering a very broad range of age for the student from 5 to 17 years old. As I have said, we collect also information among caregivers and children themselves between 12 and 17 years old. The research was submitted to the National Ethics Committee and get all the currents needed, and requested to implement the research. Next slide, please. A very short word around the methodology. So as said, we get 3 targets. First, the teachers. So with them, we decided first to implement cognitive testing with 19 teachers to explore if they declared any difficulties understanding the item or the answer, or any difficulty sharing their assessment maybe. After we decided to train them, so all the teachers selected to participate to the research received the training to explain the CFMTV and what was the philosophy behind the CFMTV. And we asked the teacher to assess their children twice, 3-week support. And after this whole process, this is the last box on the line of the teacher, we organized some focus group and case studies to collect more qualitative feedback on their experience, maybe difficulties, and also unexpected result, as we will talk about after. All the interviews with the teacher were done in English. And as said, we interviewed also caregiver using the CFM and children themselves. So we ran cognitive testing to ensure that all the items were understandable too. And we use the CFM after with 250 children. Here, the survey were done in Swahili, Kinyabwisa, and Runyankere. About the definition of disability, to analyze the reliability of the tool, we decided to use a definition, recommended by the Washington group. So we use the definition: a children was considered with functional limitation, with difficulties, if teachers or caregiver assessed a lot of difficulty or cannot do it at all for at least one domain. So we did not, open the definition as done by the UNICEF before. So next slide, please. So about the first question around the variability of the CFMTV through the domain, it was the first question from the Washington group. So if we focus on comprehensibility of the CFMTV by teacher, finally the feedback were quite positive, and finally the question were quite well understood and defined as relevant to their work environment. Nevertheless, when you look by domain, indeed you can see some difference. So some domains were not raising a lot of questions: seeing, hearing, mobility, meaning all the difficulties which were more visible. Other domain, as remembering, were more problematic. All the teacher understands remembering as capacity to remember the lesson of the previous day, and they were quite homogeneous on this one. But if you look at the guidance, it's not exactly what is expected here. So the teacher finally all understand in the same way, but not in the right way. They also discovered new domains which were not related to disability issue for them. So for example, making friends was quite new, and they did not expect to be in charge or responsible to evaluate this one. We use all this information to feed the teacher training and to be able to give very clear example and to better explain the different answers to ensure the quality of the data in the next steps. So next slide, please. So first, we analyze the inter-observer reliability of the CFMTV, asking to the teacher to assess the same children through week support. The results are not exceptional in terms of ICC and Kronberg or this kind of stuff, but finally the results just show a moderate level of agreement, which is not exceptional, but which is not bad. So our first conclusion was just to say the teachers were quite stable in their assessment of the children, and they were able to generate quite reliable disability data as proxies. Next slide, please. Then we compared the assessment from the teacher with the assessment from the caregiver. So here, clearly, the results are not the same. The level of disagreement was really important. And finally, we were not able to calculate any ICC or other statistical indices. So clearly, there is a very limited agreement between the teacher and the caregiver. What is interesting, it's nevertheless to see that finally teacher and caregiver agree when there is no disability, but our main issue was when they agree about children with difficulty, if you look at the domain, they did not agree on the domain where the difficulty was. So we tried to produce information around this to better understand why and what was behind. And without surprise, we discovered that, of course, the attitude and the perspective of the teacher and the caregiver are not the same. And teachers were really focusing on learning and ability to adapt to change. And caregivers were more focused on the well-being of the children with communication and emotional well-being. So next slide, please. The second question of the Washington group was around the external factors which may affect the reliability of the tool and the assessment by the teacher. So here it's more from some question we asked to the teacher during the survey before and after the assessment, but also during the focus group discussion. And we tried to explore the potential effect of two factors, the classroom size and the timing of the evaluation in the schooling year. So about the class size, in emergency, and especially in the continent of Africa, we are facing very high number of students in the classroom. So here we were in average around 80 or 100 students per classroom, which is a lot. So one of our assumptions was to say that it would impact the ability of the teacher to assess all the children in the same way with all the domain. And we were quite surprised because our teachers were really, really motivated. And they finally declared that the classroom size did not get any effect on their ability to assess the children. So they were quite positive on this one. And about the timing of evaluation, the hypothesis here was also we should expect a little bit before the first day of schooling and the assessment to ensure the teacher will know their student quite well. So indeed, this is the case, but this is not necessary to expect too much. Finally, 1 month seemed to be a kind of good period. Next slide, please. It was about this is an answer or a piece of answer to the last question of the Washington group about the unexpected benefit of using the CFM-TV with teacher. So indeed, we observed some benefits which were not expected from the beginning, especially just after having used the CFM-TV and getting the training. I think this is one of the important things also in this setup. Teachers really changed their attitudes and practice towards disability, and they change it very quickly in a very short-term scale. So it was interesting to explore with them, with the teacher. We declare really to have realized the needs finally of the different kids in face of them, and they quite quickly change their practice, trying to adapt, the organization of the class or the way they teach, just to ensure that they will include the kids they have identified with difficulties. Which was interesting also is that their change of attitude also impacts directly the dynamic of the class. And they all observe the reduction of the absenteeism rate and the better dynamic in the classroom. So it's what we try to represent in this kind of virtuous circle, using the CFM-TV assessment with nice impact or good impact on teacher practice, which will get directly impact on the children, the learner dynamic, and the classroom. This is something to be, of course, explored. This is just a first trend we observed, but this is quite worth to go deeper in this direction, also to confirm these nice effects in a very short scale. Next slide, please. So of course, this research is not perfect. We are just talking about one settlement in Uganda. We are trying conscious also that our teachers were really motivated and keen to participate, keen to collect information. They were really positive on this one. We met also some troubles in matching procedure, reducing our ability to do some testing maybe. For example, we did not push, to do all the analysis by functional domain. We tried, but the results were not so robust. So we decided to keep them, and maybe this is something to be explored the next time. Next slide, please. This research is part of a broader project funded by Education Cannot Wait. And the idea here is really not to stop after the research. So now we get the evidence. The idea is to produce some guidance too, just to ensure that people on the field, education practitioner, will be able to use the CFM-TV in the good way, in the good condition. I think it was something mentioned by Claudia. This is one also of our worry, just to ensure everything will be clearly presented, just to ensure people will understand how to use this tool. Next slide, but I think this is the end. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Aude. Next, we'll have Henok.
Thank you. So Save the Children also did this pilot testing of CFM teacher version in Somalia. Next, please. And the purpose was to assess reliability of CFM-TV using inter-rater reliability analysis, where 2 different teachers were assigned to a class to rate each learner in that class. And the agreement level between these 2 different teachers was assessed. The second purpose was to assess feasibility of administering the CFM tool and then to document lessons learned. Next slide, please. Looking into the context of the pilot test, this pilot test was done in Puntland State, Nugal region, Garowe district, in schools that were supported by the Norwegian Development Agency. The situation in Somalia in general can be stated a situation where there are a number of out-of-school children. So in Puntland, a report states that more than 41% of school-age children are out of school. And a report from UNICEF from 2021 indicates that at national level, 70% of all school-age children are out of school. And this is to indicate that even the more disadvantaged children with disability are actually out of school. And then identifying them in the school context is not a simple task. And this pilot test, 11 classes from 4 schools were included in the sample, and 22 teachers participated. 8 of them were female, and each teacher taught 4.4 days on average in each of these classes. There were 328 learners that were included in the pilot, and the partners in this study include the District Education Office in Somalia, Save the Children International Somalia Country Office, Save Children Norway, and Save Children International. Next, please. So we have now these 3 questionnaires that we want to provide some preliminary answers to. And is the hypothesis that results might differ by functional domain correct? Does the hypothesis that the teacher responses would vary by teacher characteristics of schools and data collection time? And also, did administering the CFM-TV have any unintended impacts on teacher awareness on disabilities? Next slide, please. The findings indicate that in the pair domain analysis, both teacher 1 and teacher 2 agreed on their rating about 15 learners that were identified to have the same type of disability by both the teachers. And these 15 learners constitute about 5% of all learners that participated in this study. So the disability prevalence in this sample gives us 5% disability prevalence. And when we look into the scene domain, for example, the fourth column shows that both teachers identified 2 learners that had disability seen. And also both learners agreed and identified 2 learners who had disability hearing. And when we look into column 1, we see that teacher 1 identified 10 learners and rated them as having disability seen, whereas teacher 2 identified and rated 17 learners as having disability seen. And so it means that it is from among these learners that 2 were actually agreed upon by both teacher 1 and teacher 2 as having disability seen. So when we see that each of these teachers had identified a larger number of learners with disability in a given domain, but when it comes to the number of learners that both of these teachers are agreed in terms of rating a learner as having disability, the number was quite small, like this. And so this indicates that these teachers had actually also challenge in determining the type of disability and also in determining the level of functional difficulty. And this was also stated by the teachers themselves in a focus group discussion. So looking into the 6th column, we see we have a percentage agreement, and this shows us this percentage agreement is in the range between 89% to 96%. So it is a high percentage agreement level. And then looking into the last column where we have Cohen's kappa value, we see the agreement was generally from slight agreement to fair agreement. So while we have high percentage agreement, the Cohen's kappa gives us, Cohen's kappa is a measure adjusted for chance or agreement by chance. And so we see that there is also a small Cohen's kappa value. And this seems to show that there is some level of discrepancy between percentage agreement and Cohen's kappa, but this is not like something peculiar to the study. There are some explanations for this low Cohen's kappa, and one of them is when we calculate disability prevalence per domain, we should expect to get a very small disability prevalence per domain, and also the fact that almost all children with disability in the Somalia context are out of school, and then this will further give us a very small disability prevalence. And therefore, it is the prevalence, the disability prevalence that we get in this data collected from a school setting that is contributing highly to small kappa value. And then we can maybe rely more on the percentage agreement for these study purposes, because we have also, we believe that the teachers have received a reasonable amount of training in administering the CFMTV and understanding the concept and definition of disability that underlies this pilot study. Next slide, please. And so in conclusion about this point, we can say that there was no substantial difference by domain in terms of level of agreement between the teacher and raters, because the agreement, percentage agreement, lies in the range 89% to 96%, although there was slight to fair agreement as indicated by Cohen's kappa. That can be due to the reasons I mentioned earlier. And so the disability prevalence is also 5%, which is actually a good disability prevalence that indicates the Washington Group question is actually a better tool as compared to the medical approach to data collection in identifying learners that have health-related functional difficulties. And then we see that practically between 6 to 12% of disability prevalence can be expected from all age group population. And then in Somalia, in Samoa and Serbia, there was a disability prevalence report from children in age group 5 to 17. The prevalence obtained was 3.2% and also 3.6%, which is actually even less than the 5% identified in this study. In Somalia, also there is a report of 3.4 to 3.9% prevalence when a binary question was used in SHDS 2020 report. This is to indicate that the prevalence now is actually something that that can indicate the level of disability prevalence in school settings. Please, next slide. Did the teachers understand the questions as intended? And was the information the teachers used to answer the questions in scope? The teachers stated that most questions were not difficult to understand due to good translation of the questions. All the questions were translated with experts and as per the guidelines from the Washington Group. And then most difficult questions were the questions on controlling behavior, anxiety, and depression. Teachers were keeping observation notice from the 2 months observation period. Document for keeping observation note was integrated with the attendance sheet. So this is actually to indicate that the teachers were continuously observing their classes and also using interaction where needed to understand the type of functional difficulty and the level of functional difficulty properly. So they use the right procedure as per our understanding. And there were 2 follow-up workshops and WhatsApp communication channels were set up to ensure that the teachers were following the guidelines, the correct guidelines for the pilot test, and also that they received the needed technical support. Information teachers used to answer the questions was in scope as they used only their observation and active interaction with learners without communication with a second teacher and anyone else about functional difficulties any of the child may have. Next slide, please. And as the teacher response would vary by teacher characteristics. We look into a comparison between contact teachers and the subject teachers, because in each of these classes, one of the teachers was a contact teacher, classroom teacher who is responsible for that classroom, and the second one was a subject teacher. And we see that contact teachers taught 4.4 days, and subject teachers also taught 4.3 days, almost the same. Several learners rated as children with disability by each teacher, while only a few learners rated by both teachers as children with this disability per domain. So what we see is there was no substantial difference in general disability prevalence reported by contact and subject teachers. Contact teachers rated 22% of learners as children with disability, while subject teachers rated 20% of learners as children with disabilities. Both agreed in rating a learner as a child with disability, regardless of agreement in type of disability. And both agreed in rating 5% of learners as having disability in specific type of domain. But if we go back to the table, please, Julie, to the table that we had, slide 3. No, I mean, if we go back to the next slide, if we go back, yeah, go back to third slide. One back, please, and back. Yes, here we see that these teachers too are actually 97% of them are contact teachers, and we see that all of the numbers in each of this domain indicates that 17, for example, in the first case against 10, 15 against 6. So all the contact teachers had rated more learners as learners with disability compared to the subject teachers. So we can see that in some level, yes, the contact teachers were had more tendency to rate learners as children with disability. Okay, next slide, please. Now let's go back to, yeah, yes, here. So analysis of agreement in rating a learner as a child with disability or as a child without disability, regardless of agreement in type of disability. And so looking into the gender differences here, we see that when both teachers were male, they agreed in 80%, compared to agreement level of 69% when both teachers were female. And then when both teachers were male, they were likely to agree on smaller proportion of learners rated as children with disability. Only 8% of the children with disability were agreed upon as having disability when both are male teachers. And compared to when they were both female, that's 18%. So here we see that when both teachers were female, they were likely to agree on more number of learners as having children with disability. And teachers of different gender were likely to agree on smaller proportion of learners rated as children with disability, that's 6%, compared to when both teachers were of the same gender, 10%. So from the pair of teachers who agreed on both existence of disability and type of disability, 15 learners, that is 5% of all the learners, teachers pair of same gender agreed on 11 of the 15, when teachers were both male agreed in 6, when teachers were both female agreed in 5. So this shows that out of the 15 learners where both teacher 1 and 2 agreed as having disability in the same domain, it was teachers of the same gender that agreed in 11 of these 15 children as having a disability in the same domain. So this indicates that gender is somehow related to rating the level of rating learners' disability status, or to rating learners as having disability. This needs more study. Actually, more rigorous study is needed to find out how and to what extent gender is related. And next slide, please. And then this table shows an agreement between teacher raters in learners' disability status regardless of agreement in disability type by rater gender. So here, when teacher's gender is same, we have a kappa value of 0.31. And when the teachers are of different gender, the kappa value was 0.14. And the average where all gender are included is the average is 0.26. So it shows up the difference between 0.31 and 0.14 also shows that gender is actually important factor in influencing learners as learners with disability. Next slide, please. And thus the teacher's response would vary by teacher characteristics. No difference in proportion of learners rated as children by teachers' age group data. And so, and also data collection in all classes were done within 2 weeks in February 2020. This means that this data collection was done immediately after the observation period of 2 months was finished. So they had fresh memory about what they have observed. Next slide, please. And about any unintended impacts on teachers' awareness of disability. Yes, the teachers themselves have mentioned some points about this. Teachers mentioned that there was increased understanding on disability and inclusive education. They became aware of more types of disability other than the visible physical functional difficulties related to learning and child development. And so they realized also there are many students with disabilities in their school, although no one recognizes them as disabled students previously. And an understanding that knowing the disability type is the first step of ensuring that child is included and actively participate in the class. And the training helped teachers to voluntarily participate in the pilot test with having a good understanding. And they felt more competent in disability inclusive education techniques compared to teachers who did not participate in the study. Next slide, please. And then the teachers have noted that establishing familiarity was not simple. Most teachers believed 2 months of observation time was not enough. And some teachers had continued contact with the same class for some years actually, but despite of the fact that they had been in contact with that same class for some years, they still found it challenging when they were asked to rate the functional difficulty of each learner in that class. So when also a teacher tried to interact, some girls did not interact actively with the teachers. This is due to some cultural and religious factors that constrain interaction. And because of this, some teachers reported that it was not really possible to identify the type of difficulty that especially a girl learner had. And determining the level of difficulty, the most difficult part of the task was determining the level of difficulty as per the feedback we received from the teachers. And some of them used different approaches. For example, asking a child to sit at different desks at the back and the front and in the middle to understand the level of seeing difficulty, for example. Continued interaction with the child is helpful to more accurately determine the level of difficulty. About 10 minutes was used to complete child functioning teacher version tool. Next, please. And the amount of time used by teachers in administering this, yes, most of them who participated in the focus group discussion said that it takes a good deal of their time to do observation interaction. And also some learned from experience and did both observation and interaction while delivering the lessons. This is to indicate that when they were actually continuing their observation and interaction, they actually found it easier because they started to actually use different approaches, or they started to be tactful in the way they did it. And then the recommendations we may have here is one, several months are needed to establish familiarity with students. Therefore, a fair length of time, at least 6 months or 4 months, is needed for teachers to rate the functional difficulty of learners. And then more rigorous practical training on determining type and level of functional difficulty for teachers is needed. Refresher training is needed during implementation of the pilot test. And therefore, when teachers are given this task, they are also, there is a need to provide support continuously to them, need to coordinate with school directors to reduce workload for teachers who participate in the pilot test. And next, I think last one. So concluding point, it is important to take into account findings from the different methods of measuring agreement and percentage agreement capabilities in comparison to global average disability prevalence, and more pilot studies that follow. Thank you so much. This is the end of presentation.
Thank you so much, Henek. Let's turn to our project from Sightsavers, and I'd like to welcome Julia.
Hi everybody. Thanks. I'm Julia de Klerk from Sightsavers. I'm going to be sharing some observations from our study in Sierra Leone, looking at the feasibility of using the CFMTV, particularly in the context of education management information systems. Next slide, please. So our study included an initial pilot of the CFMTV as well as school-based implementation of the tool, and I'll be drawing on data from both pieces of our work. In terms of the initial pilot of the CFMTV, this involved 6 pairs of teachers from 2 schools, so 12 teachers altogether. Teachers in each pair independently assessed the same 30 children using the CFMTV. This meant a total of 180 children were assessed, each by 2 different teachers. Children were from either primary or junior secondary school level. We conducted interviews and focus group discussions with the teachers, as well as drawing on the actual assessment data. For our school-based implementation component, we worked with 35 teachers from 4 different schools. The schools were 2 junior secondary and 2 primary schools. The teachers each assessed each child on their register using the CFMTV. So this meant a total of 1,830 children were assessed. Next slide, please. In terms of the prompt around variations by domain, I'm going to first share some observations in terms of understanding of questions. From our initial pilot, both our qualitative and quantitative data were very consistent in terms of which questions teachers found more straightforward and which were more challenging. The questions around seeing, hearing, and walking were very easy for teachers to assess. The most challenging questions, as described by teachers, were the ones on anxiety and depression, and we found the lowest levels of agreement between raters for these questions. Both of the questions were sometimes understood in different ways from what was envisaged. Anxiety in particular was sometimes misunderstood as eagerness. So, for example, teachers would say that children were anxious to respond to questions in class and therefore jumped up and down and raised their hands. Depression was also often linked to challenges like hunger or grief. Among the cognitive domains, teachers reported struggling the most with remembering. I think particularly some conflation with memorization here. Teachers also reported some challenges with assessing concentration. For example, saying that it might look like a child was concentrating, but you never actually knew if they were focusing on the work at hand and absorbing content or not. Teachers also reported struggling somewhat with the question around controlling behavior and accepting change. We saw that accepting change was often understood as children being willing to change their behavior when corrected by a teacher, rather than in relation to being able to accept change around them. Controlling behavior and accepting change were generally perceived as very closely related by teachers. Next slide, please. So in this slide, in the first column, for the domains, I've shown the percentage of agreement between our two teachers using all four of the categories. So some no difficulty, some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, cannot do it all. The second column indicates the percentage of agreement on the presence or absence of functional difficulty. Can you advance it? Thanks. So the first three domains, seeing, hearing, and walking, there's clearly very high agreement, both in terms of presence of functional difficulty and in the exact rating category used by the two teachers. Advance again. The fairly challenging domains in terms of remembering, accepting change, and controlling behavior, we saw around 80% agreement when looking at all four categories. And then if you advance again, with anxiety and depression, you can see that agreement drops to around 2/3. So quite a lot of disagreement there. And those are obviously the domains where teachers reported struggling the most as well. Next slide, please. Then in terms of variation by domain, I also wanted to share some data relating to agreement from different sources of data. We don't have other raters who assess the same children, but we do have some school and regional level data we looked at. So specifically the Sierra Leone annual school census and the MIX survey from 2017. Next slide, please. Looking at the data from the annual school census for Sierra Leone, this data was collected by the Ministry of Education from the schools at around the same time that we did our assessments in the schools. The annual school census included 5 categories of disability: seeing, hearing, speech, physical, and learning. Obviously, only 3 of those map very directly to CFMTV categories, but I've compared it to, I've linked physical to walking, and learning, I've compared it to the learning category in CFMTV, though you could argue for inclusion of other categories as well. And just to add, we were only able to get the annual school census data for 2 of our 4 study schools so far. Looking at this, we do note that the enrollment figures are quite different between the annual school census and our assessments, which means we wouldn't expect to see identical numbers anyway. But you can see that the numbers for the seeing domain are quite similar. Hearing is drastically different, and notably lower for the CFMTV. Speech it seems like it might be slightly higher for CFMTV. With physical disability or difficulty walking, that there's no clear pattern. And then with learning, the CFMTV seems to have identified quite a lot more children than the annual school census approach, particularly in the second school in the table, which is a secondary school. And I imagine the age of the children is also relevant here. Next slide, please. Looking now at our CFMTV data compared to the mixed data, and obviously we wouldn't expect to see identical figures, firstly because it's several years different, and the mix is obviously a much broader sample, but mix also includes children who aren't attending school, whereas we're only looking at those in school. So in general, I would have expected to see somewhat lower prevalence of functional difficulty in our data. If you could advance. So a few that stood out to me were around mobility, where our data in the first column, drawing from the CFMTV, is quite a bit lower than the national or regional estimates from mix. This could relate to exclusion of children from school with physical disabilities. It could also relate to teachers perhaps being less likely to identify children with difficulties in mobility. Advance again, please. In learning and remembering, it's clear that the figures from CFMTV are a little bit higher than those from either the mixed national or regional sample. This makes sense in light of the fact that teachers are likely to be paying quite a bit more attention to learning and remembering in the school context. Advance. And then anxiety and depression, there's clearly a big difference between the levels identified by teachers at school and those identified by parents or caregivers participating in mix. This may relate to teachers being less likely to feel confident in assessing those domains, or simply less aware of children's difficulties in those domains. Advance, please. On the second prompt, in terms of variations in quality of data in relation to other factors, we haven't done a whole lot of analysis on this yet, but I just wanted to share some very high-level observations. In our sample, there was quite a striking difference between male and female teachers in terms of the proportions of children that they identified with functional difficulties. You can see over 16% of children for male teachers compared to just 2.35% for female teachers. This seems to be coming from a small difference across all domains, with female teachers being consistently less likely to identify difficulty in any domain. But the most notable differences were in the domains of anxiety and depression. The other trend that was quite clear in our data relates to teacher age. And you can see that the proportion of children identified as having a difficulty by young teachers aged 20 to 29 was 31.68%, so almost a third of children, and notably lower for teachers in other age categories. In this case, most of the difference appeared to be coming from two domains in particular: difficulty with accepting change and difficulty in controlling behavior. So we obviously need to do a bit more work to try and understand these patterns. Advance, please. And then in terms of unanticipated impacts of the CFMTV, we are just moving into the third phase of our study, where we'll be collecting some qualitative data from teachers about their use of the CFMTV and whether and how it's impacted their teaching practices. As we start thinking about whether the use of the CFMTV has had any impact on teacher awareness of disability from the perspective of our study, a few considerations for us relate to the nature and role of the training attached to use of the CFMTV. In our study, teachers participated in training over 3 days, including some focus on disability inclusion in education more generally. So we need to try and understand the impact that the training itself may have had on teachers, and then separately the process of using the CFMTV. Another consideration is the nature and the role of supervision and support that the teachers received during the assessments, which during our study included regular check-ins and support over WhatsApp, which may have also impacted on their understanding of disability and disability inclusion more generally. And then finally, trying to think about the duration of any effect on teacher awareness of disability, and particularly thinking about this in relation to the frequency that teachers might be conducting CFMTV assessments, whether they would be likely to be doing this annually or less frequently than that. I think that's everything from very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. Our next presentation will be on the work that USAID and School to School International are doing. Rebecca, are you speaking first?
Yes, I'll start us off.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you. Julie, can you advance us to? Oh, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm Rebecca Pagel. I'm a Senior Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Advisor at USAID's Center for Education.
Rebecca, it is not easy to hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay, just give me one
Okay,
second. Is that any better?
I'm hoping so.
I will, if I speak up, is that okay? Is that better?
Yes, much
Okay.
better. Thank you.
Okay, just flag for me, Julie, if I get quiet again. All right, thanks so much, Julie and everybody. Today, we want to talk to you about a validation study of the child functioning module teacher version that we implemented through the All Children Reading a Grand Challenge for Development activity. This activity was a partnership between USAID, World Vision, and Australian Aid. And this particular study was funded by USAID and implemented by the activity's MEL partner, School to School International. Julie, you can advance to the next slide. So we'll start by talking a little bit about why we did this study. So first, I'll start by talking about the context we were in at USAID Center for Education and the USAID Ed sector more broadly when we decided to do this study. So we had just released education reporting guidance that included disability disaggregates for all of our person level indicators, including at the primary level. And we knew we needed to provide our partners with tools that they could use to disaggregate our indicator data by disability. So we put together a disability tool selection guide that included a decision tree to lead our partners through a series of questions to identify the right tool with the right respondent for disaggregating learning outcomes by disability status. And through this process, we'd identified that if we were going to ask our partners to disaggregate learning outcomes by disability status at the primary education level, we would need, of course, to have either teachers or caregivers as respondents. Though at that time, most of the validation data we had was around caregiver tools like the CFM. And then the last piece of context is that our USAID Nepal mission had reached out to us asking for support on their use of the child functioning module implemented by teachers, as the Nepal Ministry of Education wanted to know if they could use the CFM to collect data for their EMIS system and as an early screening tool to identify children who might need to be flagged for medical diagnosis in the context of their schools. So given this context, we designed this child functioning module teacher version validity study. Julie, you can just click. Thanks. So we designed this study to respond to the context that we had and the needs we'd identified. So the first purpose of this study was to understand the circumstances in which the CFMTV produced valid data for disaggregating learning outcomes. Of course, this was to help us support our partners to disaggregate all of our indicator data by disability status. You can click, Julie. And the second purpose was to learn more about how the tool worked in the context of Nepal, and particularly if it could be used for the purpose of understanding not only disability prevalence, but also identification as an early screening tool. So this was our context, these were our purposes, and now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Anne, who is our lead researcher on this study, to talk to you a little bit about what we learned.
Thanks, Rebecca. My name is Anne Neseke. I'm the Deputy Director for Research and Evaluation at School to School and was the lead researcher on this study, as Rebecca just mentioned. I also want to note that I just dropped a link to our full study in the chat. It's always very difficult to distill a large study into just a few slides. So if you want any more details about what we talk about here, you can find it there. And to give a couple of quick overall takeaways regarding those two purposes that Rebecca mentioned just now, we did in our study find that in Nepal, the CFMTV could be used for disaggregating reading outcomes by disability status, specifically for the purpose of national estimates. That's what the tool was designed for, and it seems to be working just fine for that particular purpose. We were looking at a few different factors that might affect this. So in different contexts beyond just national estimates, we think the CFMTV may probably also would provide valid data, but there are a few aspects to consider, specifically the time point of data collection. This is really closely related to teacher familiarity with the students. So a little bit later in the school year would allow teachers to provide more accurate data around those learners. And then school type, language of the tool, and the domains that teachers report on are things that I'll talk about in a bit more detail as we proceed. If you could go to the next slide, Julie, thank you. The second purpose around individual identification and pre-screening, we found that the CFMTV is not really recommended as a pre-screening tool for this particular purpose. And what we saw was that teachers were underreporting the proportion of learners, and we looked at this specifically in the domains of vision and hearing. And we looked at this at both the cutoff, the standard cutoff of a lot of difficulty and cannot do it all. And then we looked at this with the addition of some difficulty as a cutoff as well. And there's a lot more detail about this in the report, but even with that cutoff of some difficulty, we saw that teachers were missing learners who might have some impairment. And so the CFMTV wouldn't necessarily catch all of the learners who might need additional services. If we can go on to the next slide. So moving on to those three questions that we were asked to speak to for this particular presentation today, specifically around differences in evaluations. First, we looked at teacher interpretations of the different domains, as many of our other colleagues did in their studies. And from cognitive interviews, we saw that teachers often had some confusion, or they had the most confusion around the psychosocial domains, specifically around anxiety and depression. And teachers often noted that they needed some additional training in those areas, or in contexts where Nepali was not the main language that was used in that area, they had some difficulty understanding what those questions were actually getting at. We also saw that there were some out of scope interpretations for some of those psychosocial domains, but then also other domains such as concentrating, where teachers might have linked that more to the ability to follow instructions, or remembering, where we saw that teachers were often conflating that with memorization of school materials. Some of the out of scope activities or out of scope interpretations also had to do quite a bit with conforming to cultural norms or just obedience in general. So there was some confusion for teachers around that. And then another thing that we found in terms of teacher interpretations was that this was greatly impacted by the school type. So our sample included mainstream schools with resource classrooms for learners who needed special accommodations, special schools for learners with disabilities, and religious schools or madrasas. And what we saw was that in special schools, teachers were comparing learners with other learners in special schools rather than learners writ large. So this may have definitely impacted their interpretation of difficulty. There was one particular example in a school for learners with cerebral palsy where we have a quote from the teacher there who said, "When we're around people like us, then it's easy. As soon as we have to go outside, we feel that we're not able to do certain things." So they had made significant accommodations for learners in the school to enable them to function without much difficulty. And that definitely affected the way that teachers were rating the learners, especially in mobility in that school setting. Next slide, please. We also looked at consistency between teachers on the CFMTV and then caregivers who provided responses about the same learners on the CFM. And we can see here in the left-hand column, the overall level of agreement in overall functional difficulty and then individual domains. And then in the right-hand column, we have the kappa coefficient, which provides, as Henok described, a measure of agreement, which takes probability and chance into account there. So we saw that for overall functional difficulty, there was 84.9% agreement between teachers and caregivers for learners, with a kappa coefficient of 0.63, which indicates substantial agreement. And there was also substantial agreement in the hearing domain. And we saw slightly lower agreement and reliability between teachers and parents in vision, where the agreement was 90.6% and the kappa coefficient was 0.56. And as I mentioned, we see similar rates of agreement, but lower prevalence or lower kappa ratings as we look at the other domains, especially the psychosocial domains. Specifically in anxiety and depression, where the agreement rates were 88.1% and 88.5%, and the kappa coefficient was less than 0.1 and was even negative in the case of depression. So that indicates that there was some inconsistency in interpretation and some difficulty in understanding those domains, as I mentioned before, with the teacher interpretations. Next slide, please. We also looked at consistency in terms of teacher responses compared with medical screening data, as I mentioned before. So what we see here is the prevalence as identified by teachers in purple, caregivers in this like greenish yellow color, and then medical screenings in blue for vision and hearing. And essentially what we saw here, as I mentioned before, is that teachers were under-identifying learners with difficulty in vision and hearing as compared to those medical screenings. We'll go on to the next slide as well. I won't go through everything on this slide, but it does include in the top two rows the measures of sensitivity and specificity for vision and hearing. But overall, what we saw was that accuracy between teachers and medical screenings and vision was pretty good. We had 93.2% agreement and a kappa of 0.73. And we saw that results in hearing were a little bit more mixed in this case. The agreement between teachers and medical screenings was 86.8%, and the kappa was 0.54. As I mentioned, there's much more detail about this in the report, but what we saw was that in hearing, teachers were definitely able to identify extreme cases of hearing impairment, as defined medically. But when it came to more moderate or more mild cases, teachers tended to be missing those. So that's some of the context around why we think that this might not be a great tool for a pre-screening. If we move on to teacher ratings, this kind of addresses the questions around factors, teacher characteristics that might play a role in the quality of evaluations. One thing that we found was that class size seemed to increase or decrease the odds of a learner being identified as having a functional difficulty. In our sample, the average class size was 37 learners per class, and we saw that lower class size decreased the odds of a learner being rated as having a functional difficulty. And this was even when controlling for things like school type and province. So we also saw that smaller class size was statistically significantly associated with teachers' self-reported familiarity with learners. Teachers with lower than average class sizes reported that they knew 61.6% of their learners very well, compared to 54.8% of teachers who knew their learners very well in larger than average class sizes. So it seems that this is kind of linked, and that sort of like makes sense on a gut level, you know, that teachers in larger class sizes wouldn't know as many of their learners very well. And this probably plays a role into that ability to rate learners accurately. And that's something that teachers highlighted in cognitive interviews as well. Next slide, please. We also looked at and saw that a teacher's self-reported comfort level teaching learners with disabilities factored into prevalence as well. There was higher, teachers with higher than average comfort teaching learners with disabilities had lower odds of rating a learner as having a difficulty. But what we found here was a little bit counterintuitive, because teachers with above average comfort levels were mostly mainstream school teachers or mainstream school teachers with resource classes, not, as we sort of expected, teachers in special schools for learners with disabilities. So we think that there needs to be more exploration of this, and perhaps we need to use a different measure than self-reporting. But we think that what may actually be happening here is that teachers who don't have as much experience teaching learners with disabilities are reporting that they're more comfortable doing so than other teachers would be. But again, that's another thing to add to our list for future research. I also wanted to highlight that there were some differences in language of instruction. We looked at overall Nepali as a language of instruction, NSL or Nepali Sign Language, and then several other languages, because Nepal is a very multilingual context. As you might expect, obviously, teachers using NSL in the classroom had a much higher prevalence of functional difficulty in their classrooms. That's because they're in special schools for deaf learners. So that wasn't really a surprise to us. What was a surprise was the much lower prevalence of learners having a functional difficulty in schools where non-Nepali and non-NSL languages were used as the language of instruction. This was like pretty closely linked with school type as well, and province. This was seen mostly in the Madhya province. And we think that there were probably some other additional factors at play here. But again, given that teachers from these areas were speaking about and indicating that they were having some difficulty understanding some of the domains, I think this just re-highlights for us the importance of having a tool translated into many different contexts beyond just the official language in a specific country. I also wanted to highlight that there were a few factors that we looked at that did not show any effect on the likelihood of rating a learner as having a functional difficulty or not. So those factors included the teacher's gender, the number of years of experience that a teacher had being a teacher, if teachers had received any training on the Washington Group domains previously, or if they'd received training on inclusive education. Those things didn't seem to have any effect on the way that teachers were rating their learners. So moving on to the last slide, we wanted to touch on this question of any unintended impacts on teachers' awareness of disability as a result of the CFM-TV. This wasn't a main research question of ours, but we did see in interviews with teachers that the teachers felt that the CFM-TV was generally easy to use, and it often helped them think about learners' needs on a more individual basis. So we have a quote here from a teacher who said that the CFM-TV enabled me to understand many contexts on disability and difficulty. This was an opportunity to think about the students and their functioning and school environment. And we heard similar things from other teachers pretty frequently. They would especially talk about the fact that the CFM-TV, structured as it was by domain, helped them think through different dimensions of their learners and how they were functioning, and was a helpful tool in kind of changing their perceptions this way. Teachers then often would go on to tell us that they needed more training in these areas. So 96.2% thought it would be helpful to have more in-depth training on the CFM-TV tool and like what was meant by the different functional difficulty domains. They also requested additional training on inclusive practices in teaching and ways to make their classrooms more accessible to learners with disabilities. Many of them voiced this emotion that like, we now know a little bit more about how to identify learners with disabilities, but we don't know what to do to actually help them in our classrooms. So that was identified as a pretty major need in this area. And we hope that our work moving forward can work towards addressing that need. So thank you. That's a very short synopsis of all of our findings. Like I said, the link to the report is in the chat if you would like to take a look at it and dig into the nuances and specifics a bit more.
Thank you, Anne. And thank you to all of our presenters in this session. The body of work that is happening to evaluate the context in which the CFM-TV can operate and operate well is rather impressive. And, we don't have a lot of time for questions and discussion, but I will end by saying that what we are looking to do in the future, the Secretariat is thinking about ways to bring together at some level, even a high level, the body of findings that are coming in from these evaluations and putting together some kind of document that we can share out that talks about those findings. And I think some of the themes that you've heard today resonate across all of these projects. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close session 2. I do want to go straight to session 3, which is about the best practices for our library of tools. And I will turn it over to Cordell.
Hey, Julie. Thank you, everyone. And well, it's good to see a lot of familiar names in the participant list. And so as Julie mentioned, this session, it'll focus on just the Washington Group tool translations and kind of best practices for disseminating them. And so in her introduction this morning, Jennifer mentioned that, we've developed several translations that we considered official and they're kind of based on the UN languages, but we've increasingly, have been receiving requests for translations that go beyond just the languages that are posted on the website. And so, Jennifer's going to give a brief overview of our current practices for collecting and disseminating the translations, and then also discuss a proposed policy for moving forward, how to handle this growing demand and request for translations. And Jennifer also mentioned this morning that there would be some poll questions, throughout the sessions. So this will be the first session that, we have poll questions. So forward to, your feedback and your input on how we should move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Cordell. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, it's kind of, Anne gave me kind of a good lead in here for this talk. In most survey situations, almost all I'd say, questionnaire instruments are developed, particularly in an international situation, where they're written in one language, the source language, and then they're translated into other languages. It is possible to create the initial tool in many languages at the same time, but it's almost never done. It's very intensive. So there is a need to do translations anytime a tool is going to be used for internationally, because if the translation isn't done correctly, and it doesn't reflect the original intent of the questions, then any data that are obtained from that translation are not going to meet the user needs for which the tool was developed. And also, extremely important, will not be comparable to data collected using the source language or any of the other translations. That the differences will be due to the translation and not to anything, quote unquote, real. I say this is true for every survey instrument, but I think it's particularly true for this topic area of disability, because of the variation in how disability is interpreted and understood, but also because of just the range of factors that we tend to include when we're looking at disability. So this was really known early on in the work of the Washington Group. Even actually, as we were developing the questions, I remember sometimes someone would say, that would be really hard to translate, into my language. So maybe we need to find a different approach in English. So to address this need, the Washington Group developed translation guidelines for its own data collection tools, building on best practices, general best practices in translation. But we do have documents that specifically address the translation of the Washington Group tools. Next slide. Now, that was done, and we hoped everything would just proceed on well. And we started getting a lot of requests for translated versions of the tools. This is actually a good thing, that anybody who wanted to use the tool would contact the Washington Group and say, do you have a translation in a particular language? And we developed a mechanism, as Cordell said, for how we deal with these requests for translations and how we make them available to the requesters. And as I mentioned, we also get translations from others that they've done. With the passage of time, and you saw from my earlier slides, the number of translations that we receive and the number of requests that we get for translation is growing, and is really starting to present some challenges in how we implement our current mechanism. And this has come up in past meetings, past annual meetings, and where the Secretary proposed that we really revisit these mechanisms and our principles here and see if we can do a better job. And a small subgroup was convened and has developed a proposal for a revised mechanism. It was a small subgroup. Thank you, Elena. And we are presenting to you today the way we think we should move forward. Next slide. So our current policy, we have a set of translations that we refer to as official, and these are directly posted on the website. You don't have to ask anybody, go to the website, get your translation. Official is probably a misnomer here. They were official because they were the ones that we were giving out on the website. They were paid for by available grant funding that we had at the time, and the process was coordinated by the Secretariat. We employed professional translators to do these translations, and we focused on the official UN languages since we are a UN city group. What is important to remember is the translation do not necessarily follow our own best practices for translation. For example, they may or may not have been cognitively tested, which is one of our best practices. Remember, our main best practice is that you should use the TRAPD method, which, as opposed to forward-backward, as a conceptual method, and that the translations be cognitively tested to make sure that the words are being understood in the same way as the English words. These official translations did not go through cognitive testing. Next slide. Then we have what I'm calling other translations. This is any translation that's not a quote unquote official translation that's on the website. As I said, we receive multiple translations from multiple sources, and we needed a way to make those available to users. So a few years back, or maybe more than a few, we created a list that we posted on the website where users can search to see if the Secretariat has a translation that they're interested in. And I forgot exactly when, but we had some money from one of the grants where we could, when we redid the website, we kind of redid this piece to make it a little bit more user-friendly. You can search by language, you can search by country. Now, once you do that and you see, they have a translation in my language, then you have to contact the Secretariat who will give it to you, because these are not official translations. So also, the Secretariat does not endorse any of these translations. Now, the number of translations that the Secretariat is receiving is taking a considerable amount of time just to process. So there are translations that are currently not listed on our list that we actually have in-house, and we kind of go through those as we can. But it's a bit of a issue that we just need to be aware of. Next slide, please. Again, users then request copy of the translation that's on website. Secretariat provides the translation, always with the caveat that we do not endorse these translations, and we do not know if they've gone through the best practices. This is just what we have. We have also received queries from some people who have done a translation that ask us about the process for certifying a translation as official. They've worked hard on their translation, they've followed all our practices, they've cognitively tested the translation, and they would like it to be official and made widely available. That was one of the reasons we started down this path. We asked ourselves the question of how would one now label something as an official translation? We hadn't really thought about that. The Secretariat cannot determine whether a translation is accurate. It's a major undertaking in any case, but the languages, they're so varied. There's just no way the Secretariat could do it, nor do they have the resources to try to figure out a way to have somebody else do it, in terms of a payment or something, like the way we were able to pay the original translators. Next slide, please. So the small work group addressed the following questions. How do we determine the quality of a translation? If we want to decide whether something is official, how would we determine how to make that determination? How are we going to deal with multiple translations in the same language? We do have multiple translations in the same language. How should we obtain translations? Right now, we just kind of wait for somebody to send them to us. And then once we get them, how do we curate them in a way that is useful for both those who want translations and for the Secretariat in terms of what the Secretariat can manage? And then, how do we disseminate them? Once we've curated them, how do we get them out? We could put everything up on the web and just say, buyer beware. We don't know if any of these are any good. We could ask, maintain our current practice where someone has to ask it of the Secretariat, where the Secretariat tells them we don't know if it's how good it is, or we could have some hybrid approach. So these were the basic 4 questions that we kind of focused on when we started. And we came up with a potential policy, which we're going to ask you through the poll questions to endorse or not now, because we really do need to move forward on this. Our first proposal: stop using the term official translation. These were just translators that were funded by the Washington Group, but they do not follow necessarily our best translation policies because they haven't been cognitively tested. They are official UN languages. Maybe that's where official came from, but we are recommending ending that category. There will be no official translations. However, we do recommend retaining the current listing of translations available and keeping it up to date as possible, as quickly as we can. So we do want to maintain that listing that we currently have. But we're saying we want to go further. And now we don't have two categories. We don't have official and other. We just have translations. And we could provide information that the Washington Group Secretariat has in hand on how the translation was done, and who uses it. So, for example, is this translation that you have just given us used in a data collection sponsored by the NSO in the country or by a partner? For example, is this the UNICEF translation of CFM in that language? We could make that available. How was the translation done and how did you evaluate it? Did you follow the best practices? Did you do cognitive testing? What are the results of your testing? We could consider adding all of this to a database for each of the translations we have in-house. Now, again, the Secretariat, the Washington Group, does not endorse any translation. It would just provide information that it has that would allow the user to evaluate whether they want to use that translation. Okay, so right now we're recommending get rid of official, we will not use it anymore, maintaining the list, and then expanding, which will be more work, what we know about each of the translations so users can make the best decision about whether or not they want to use that translation. Next, please. Okay, so there are certain implications of this new policy. If we're going to ask people to tell us whether or not they use the TRAPD method, do we just take their word for it, or what kind of documentation do we need that in fact that method was used and that cognitive testing was done? We could just say, we will just report whatever is told to us. We will not provide this background, but we may want to. So we have to determine that. The information about how the translation was done may not be available now. We could ask it now, moving forward. Any new translation we get, we could have a little questionnaire that the provider has to fill out. If they don't have the information, we don't include it, but we would ask for it. It may be the information is missing. We have to decide if that's okay. We'll just have missing in there. The user then knows we don't have that information. They can't rely on it. We just have to make that decision. It would take some resources to try to track down information on existing translations, which may not exist, but we could ask some of our partners, and when I say partners, I mean you all, to help us with that. And we probably would have to develop some kind of categorization system to structure all this information, some kind of database that we could put this information in, so it would be easily accessible. Okay, and what we really actually want in there. So all of these things would still need to be done. We haven't done them yet. So we want you to be aware of that before you decide how to move forward. But these are the things that we'd have to decide on. And we can decide to do more or less, for example, in terms of how hard do we try to find this information about the translation. Next slide, please. We have the issue again of multiple translations for the same language, often in the same country. The Washington Group would not favor one over the other. All versions would be made available. But again, if one of those translations is the official translation that's used in the census, a user may want to know that. We can make that information available if we have it. Alternatively, we could ask the producers of the different translations to kind of come together and come up with a consensus. That may be a heavy lift and they may not be willing to do it. And alternatively, we could ask the regional groups to take on some of these activities related to translations used in their region. They could determine if it would be beneficial to have a standard translation, or perhaps they could provide some, help us get some information about how the translations that we have on hand were actually done. So again, these are all things, these are implications of the policy. We'd have to decide on this. Next slide. Okay, that is the proposal. I'm going to stop here. Again, I'm only hearing what's happening through my phone, which Julie has at her computer. For some reason, my speakers aren't working. So I'm going to ask if there are any questions about this. And if they are, I'll fix my phone so I can hear you, or you can put them in the chat, or maybe Julie, you can answer. I don't know. Does anybody have any questions?
I'm not seeing anything initially. Sometimes it takes a few seconds.
Okay.
So just to be clear, you're seeing the questions on the screen that will be released to you via a poll momentarily. So you'll be able to answer these questions. But before we do this, are there any questions about how the Secretariat obtains any translations, what translations we have, or anything else that Jennifer mentioned in terms of the proposed new policy?
Just want to make sure everyone understands the new policy because you're voting on it. Okay, all right.
So, all right. I'm going to launch the first poll, which are these 6 questions, and we'll give it about a minute or 2. So if someone is able to just let me know if you can see that poll on your screen, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. So first one is, should we do away with the label? The second is, should we retain the current listing so that people can see what's there? And the third is, should we create a document that includes as much information as we have available for each translation that's listed in that listing? Oh, I think we do. Julie, are we doing all the questions at once?
Yes, people can kind of scroll up and down in this poll window and answer the questions. I see that about 14 people have answered through question 6 right now. We have 93 participants online. So we're at 27 responses thus far, but it's increasing as we go. We're at 41, 42, 43 and counting. We seem to be holding steady at 54 responses, which is 60% of those participating. I'm gonna give this just a few more seconds and then do a countdown, and then I'll end the poll. Okay, in 10, 9, 8, any final responses? 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we have 56 responses. And I can see, let me just mention really quickly, I can see the results here. And for questions 2 through 6 on your screen, the overwhelming answer is yes. The closest question has to do with the label official. And there we have 60% saying yes to do away with the official and 40% no. But in general, the answer to these questions, all 6 questions is yes.
Great, thank you, Julie. We don't have to talk about it now, but for those of you who answered, they'd like to retain the label, if you could, kind of let us know why you had that. This was, I think, the easiest one for us to come up with, is that we felt so uncomfortable with calling it official when we hadn't followed our own rules, that was an easy one for me anyway. But I would be curious why you felt we should retain it. So if you could maybe just drop an email at some point in the future. I'm taking from this that we'll move forward with this. It does require a fair amount of work on the part of the Secretariat to kind of set this up. Oh, whoops, they were there. The poll results there for a minute and then they left. So it'll be a work in progress. We will contact the regional groups to see how they can assist. We will maintain our small group with anyone can join if they like, to make some decisions about how to move forward and how to kind of implement this in terms of what do we ask for and how do we ask for it and how much documentation do we really want. We'd love a lot of documentation, but if we get a lot of documentation, we have to curate it. We have to make it available. And so that we, as the Secretariat, we really have to weigh how useful it is versus whether, how long it's going to take us to get it in people's hands. It may be extremely useful, but we just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So we'll make those decisions, and hopefully at next year's meeting, we can come back to you with where we are in the implementation of doing this, and start the process of transitioning from our old process to a new one. I believe you saw there was a draft document about this transition, and we will take that document and kind of make it into a new policy, and that new policy will then be posted on the website, and we will kind of share that with the steering committee and anyone else who would like to be involved in this activity. It doesn't take a huge amount of time, honestly, it doesn't. We had 2 or 3 meetings and we were able to come up with this. So if anyone else would like to join us, just drop us a note, but please tell us why you were a little more interested in keeping the official designation than we thought you would be. Okay, that's it for this session, which is only 3 minutes late. Yay.
Hey, Jennifer, one more thing before we move on. For question 6, so the response is to post all the translations on the website. So it would be helpful to have feedback from everyone and just on how they would like to see that information organized, because I know we kind of go back and forth whether we organize it by country, we organize it by language. There are kind of multiple ways to provide this information on the web. So it would be helpful to have input, and you can join the work group as Jennifer suggested, or you can send the information via email. But if you have any suggestions on just how, when everything is posted on the website, how it should be organized, that would be extremely helpful. And I think with that, we'll move on to session 4. And, Jennifer mentioned in the opening that, we used to have kind of a pre-meeting for new members, and also it's somewhat of a refresher for old members, just to provide some information on the history of the Washington Group and the founding principles. So I'm going to pass it back to Jennifer to kind of give a brief overview of, just the history of the Washington Group and then our founding principles.
Thanks, Cordell. Yeah, so again, we used to have these when we met in person, and it was a good way for new members to get more acclimated into what the work had been done, and also old members to kind of revisit some of our early work, which was, I say, much more targeted. And I think you'll see that as we go through the history. But again, this is being done to provide information to those who may not be familiar, because sometimes we kind of forget, even now, even all that's been happening, we sometimes forget why we created these tools and what they were primarily supposed to do, but also to tee up the conversation on the last day about where do we move from here? What else would you like to do? So think about that as I go through this. I will try to keep to the half hour so that we can end on time. Again, any questions you have, put them in the chat or raise your hand at the end. Okay, so the beginning. This is the beginning of the journey. Then June 2001, there was an international seminar on the measurement of disability that was run by the UN. It was in New York. This was a kind of standard UN seminar on disability, because most of it was about how the data were really crummy and it was completely non-comparable and nobody knew what to do about it. The end of the meeting, the recommendation was made that the UN Statistical Commission should set up a city group that would focus on disability measurement. That was adopted. That suggestion was adopted at the following meeting of the commission, which was around March in 2002, I think. And that's when we kind of started. Now, our early meetings, plus what we were given as a mission by the commission, was that we had about kind of 4 things that we were going to work around. This is what we were supposed to do as a city group. We needed to address the need for population-based measures of disability. And for us, that meant, what were those needs? First, we had to define the needs. It's a huge area, disability statistics. Where was the need? We wanted to foster international cooperation in this area. It's related to health. It isn't health, but it's related to health. Because it's related to conditions, it's related to injuries, it's within that domain, that broad domain. Why did we want to have international cooperation? Because we wanted to have comparable data, and we needed to do that jointly. The measures the tools that we were to develop had to be internationally tested. They had to be shown to produce similar data. And finally, we wanted to incorporate these tools into national statistical systems. We will get back to this today, and we wanted to mainstream them. A lot of data collections before were either special studies, they might have been studies that were, organized by a third party, that might have been a UN agency, but it was not the country itself. We needed to have this as part of ongoing national data collection, so it would always be there. It's kind of, you collect information on age, you collect information on gender, you collect information on poverty, you collect information on disability. It's part of the core system. Next slide. The other things that we started out worrying about and thinking about is how do we organize ourselves? Part of the problem with this is that this city group is the largest city group. Most of the city groups that came before were very focused, very pointed, very technical, and had a relatively small number of members. It's changed a little bit over time, but certainly when we started, and I remember talking to our colleagues at UNSD saying, what's a city group and how do we do it? They said, oh, you know, it's 10 or 12 countries. We have membership from 168 countries and international organizations and organizations that represent persons with disabilities and NGOs. It is a just much broader kind of organization, and we needed to figure out our self-governance. And there's actually a governance document, but the main thing is that the countries have ownership. Countries going to develop it, countries are going to use it, countries have ownership. It is not a top-down organization, it's we're all in it together organization. But we do have a secretariat. The secretariat has always been at NCHS. It is still at NCHS. It is the group that organized that first meeting and has continued to do that. The secretariat provides important administrative functions, interacts with data requests like from UN. But the real work of the group is done by work groups and a steering committee. There is a steering committee that oversees everything, but mostly it's the work groups that carry out the work plan, and any member can have input. So the emphasis has always been on evidence. We are using these questions because we tested them this way, and these are the results. Transparency, everything we have is on that website. That website is extremely comprehensive. And we had extensive testing of the data collection tools in as many countries as we can. Now recall, city groups are unfunded. They get no money from the UN's Commission, Statistical Commission, or UN Statistical Division. They're completely unfunded. It's all volunteer work. We have been lucky that we, over the years, have gotten grants from other people. The first from the World Bank, currently from Germany. We've had funding from ESCAP, and we've had funding from Australia. All of the funding really made it possible to do what we wanted to do. But we had to do testing, and that funding in many pages allowed us to do that testing and allowed us to do all of these things. I wish we had more funding, but right now we have very targeted funding. Next slide. So we had to figure out what were we going to measure and how are we going to go about doing it? What was our approach? Because disability is so complicated. It's so encompassing. It's so comprehensive. We know that it's a very complex topic because it incorporates so many different components. It's got everything about your body function and structure. All of that is part of disability. How all of that affects your ability to do things, and then how all of that affects your ability to participate in society. So, are you missing a limb and can you work? So that whole thing. And plus it has all this environment. You know, it depends whether you'll be able to work if you have an impairment. It depends on the environment you live in, and it depends on your personal characteristics. So when you look at this, it's like everything. It's all of life. But the language of disability is not specific, so you can't just say, do you have a disability? That was shown early on. The language is very general, it's interpretive, people mean very different things, they use the word the same way, 2 different ways in the same sentence, and we also have the issue of stigma. So we had to figure out how to address for data collection, how do we operationalize data collection for this very complicated topic that also has these other issues like stigma attached to them. Next slide. So the objectives of the group, and this was laid out in the first couple of meetings through a very in-depth conversation, was to develop a set of questions that capture part of that disability complex that can be used to get valid, reliable, and internationally comparable data. So we were not going to tackle the whole thing, at least not in the beginning, but we really put the focus on valid, reliable, and internationally comparable. And I should add here, useful for the policy purposes for which they were being collected. So while they only capture a part of that model, the questions that, they're short, they only capture a bit. The idea was that they should be used in conjunction with other data that are collected already, that are already part of the national statistical system, such as education, employment. And when you use our questions in conjunction with those questions, then you can start kind of seeing the whole picture. You can start looking at the entire disability model. And those analyses, when you combine the disability questions that we were going to develop with these outcome questions, that is what is consistent with the social model. So on their own, the questions don't tell you a whole lot about the social model. In conjunction with other data, they do. Next question. Next slide, please. And this is the model. This is the ICF model that actually was developed right around the time we were starting. And as you can see, it's got everything in there: body function and structure, health conditions, participation, activities, personal factors, and environment. I guess, as I said, everything about life. We were focusing on that green bit, what we are started to call activities and limitations. We were not looking at body function. We weren't looking at whether there was a missing limb, or we weren't looking at conditions. We weren't interested if you had arthritis. We weren't interested if there had been an injury. We're interested in how those things might affect your ability to function, and we called that activities, and we were looking at limitations or difficulties in that. That's where we were focusing our work, because in that space, there were kind of universal basic actions that would apply to all countries. Again, how to be relevant to all countries. That's where we are in the model. And as you'll see in the next slide, what we want to see is whether limitations or difficulties in those basic functions impact your ability to participate. Because it's not a necessary thing that they would. Your environment could be such that they won't impact it. And I think it was Anne maybe who mentioned that in some schools, there was no difficulty because the school had been organized, so there were no difficulties for those children. But in another school, there would be. So the importance of the environment tells you, kind of conditions that relationship. And what we are trying to do from a policy point of view is break that link. We want to create an environment where it doesn't matter what your basic functioning is, you can still fully participate. And that is very consistent with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and also the SDGs. Next slide, please. So this is the disaggregation we were aiming for. We were going to create the questions that would allow you to determine whether someone had or didn't have disabilities. And then we would look at some outcome measure. Remember, percent employed. If the bars are the same, then we have met the objectives of the SDGs and the UNCRPD. We have equal participation, not related to disability status. If they're not, as they are here, we have much higher employment among those without disability, then we haven't met the objective. But the questions were designed to just be able to divide the population into groups according to their disability status, and their disability status is a function of their difficulties in doing these basic actions. Next slide. So the challenge, we still have this very complicated model. How do we identify that population using a limited number of questions? Remember, we want to put these on a census. We need to do it in a consistent manner so everybody has to understand it. And it has to be done in this cross-culturally comparable way. So we have to try to make these as neutral as possible to the cultural context. Next slide. Again, disability is complicated, but the questions have to be simple. They have to be understood. So the approach in terms of identifying who does not have a disability, identifying those groups, was to look at, because of difficulties doing these basic universal actions like seeing, puts you at a greater risk than the general population for those limitations. So we're looking for identifying that group that is at greater risk because of these limitations in an unaccommodating environment. If there's a greater risk, it's because the environment is not accommodating. Next slide. And after many years of writing, revising, testing, retesting, we came up with the Washington Group short set, which is now ubiquitous in data collection. 6 questions, the smallest we could get. Basic functions, seeing, hearing, walking, remembering, self-care, and communicating, with 4 answer categories. Important, not a yes, no. 4 answer categories to get a continuum of functioning. Functioning disability, not inherently dichotomy, inherent continuums, which means you have to draw a line. We're trying to get as much information on that continuum as possible. Next slide. So the objectives we set out for us early on, and which really controlled our work and our meetings, I'd say for the first maybe 5 years, was to identify persons with similar types and degree of limitations in these basic actions, regardless of nationality or culture. They would represent the majority, but not all persons with limitations. We knew that. There was no way with this very short set we would be able to get everybody, but they needed to represent the most commonly occurring limitations that we could capture in a census. Again, we had this need to be able to put these in a census. Next slide. Intended use of the data, again, disaggregation and comparing levels of participation with and without disability. Obviously, you get prevalence from doing that. You create a population, you get the prevalence. But the idea was not so much to get prevalence, the idea was to look at the disaggregation. When you do this over time, you can monitor the effectiveness in programs and policies that were supposedly put in place to promote participation, to accommodate any functional limitation. And you can look at prevalence and monitor and see if it changes. Some of those prevalences are more a function of prevention and medical care, but the disaggregation is what's a function of the environment. So these 6 little questions give you a huge amount of information to characterize the population, and in conjunction with other information already collected to determine whether the level of participation. Next slide. And we knew there were limitations, there always are. The questions are not appropriate for under 5. That turned out to be a huge challenge. And we knew that these 6 domains miss developmental issues of importance to children. That was a big issue. We also knew we were missing psychosocial issues that would not move through either communication, cognition, or self-care. Okay, so the psychosocial limitations are related to some of the other domains, but some are not, and it certainly was not, we were not able to identify them. You know, there are other limitations, which I don't really see as limitations of the short set. They were not designed to do this, but they are limitations that you would want to address in terms of broader data collection, and that's age at onset, directly capturing environmental barriers, and the impact of, for example, assistive devices on people's ability to participate. Those last 3 things, there's no way. That was not the intent. The intent was to identify the population. These are things that we didn't do, think we should have done, whereas the first 2 are really limitations in the population identified that we need to be aware of. The solution was to ask lots more questions, and we knew if we had done that, no questions would have gotten on. So I think I often ask myself now that I've been in this business for so many years, if not these 6, what would you do? And is what you would do going to make it impossible to do it? By having 20 questions, will you get no data? Is it better to have 6 and know the limitations and build on it? And we came down to, it's better to have 6, know the limitations, and then build on it, than to have nothing. Next slide. You've already heard about how widely adopted these are. They are being used by NSOs in censuses and household surveys. They're used by development agencies. They're used by NGOs, DPOs, again, used a lot by other parts of the UN. They're recommended for the 2020 round of census. They've had a lot of adoption. I think because they're usable. You can use them, and they do provide critical information that has been shown to be useful for policy and program purposes. Next slide. They can be put in censuses easily. They can be put in household income and expenditure surveys, and they are. The World Bank does that. They're in the demographic and health surveys. They're in mix. They're in labor force surveys. We partner with the ILO. They're in national disability surveys. They're the core of those. And they can be used for administrative data, not instead of criteria that are in administrative data for benefits, but in addition to. Next slide. Work continued. We could have stopped. We could have stopped after the short set and said, we made our main objective, we're done, congratulate ourselves and move on. But we didn't. We realized that there was more to be done. Adding those extra domains was the primary function, the extended set and the enhanced set, where we do add psychosocial and we do get upper body, and we do start talking about the impact of assistive devices. So in both those situations, we are going beyond in terms of domain and use of assistance. With UNICEF, we developed the child functioning module, which you've heard about now, a new version of the teacher version for children 2 to 4 and for children 5 to 17, which includes those domains specific to child functioning. And with the ILO, we developed a module for labor force surveys that also addresses environmental barriers more directly, the facilitators and barriers to employment. Next slide. And what are we doing? You've heard about a lot of these today. The child functioning module teacher version, which has the potential of being included in administrative data like Emma says. You'll hear tomorrow about the inclusive education module, which actually builds on the CFM and then looks at characteristics of the school environment and other environments to see whether education is being gotten. And then you will hear on Wednesday on the work to develop better psychosocial and mental health questions. We have them on there. We've never been happy with them, and we wanted to do better. And that work group is doing phenomenal work in trying to expand the questions we have in that domain. Again, probably not for censuses, but for surveys. So again, getting back to this idea of mainstreaming, the idea was to take any data collection, for example, that you're getting your SDGs out of, include the questions. Once they're in there and they're integrated, you will be able to disaggregate and disaggregate the SDGs and inform on the CRPD. Now, I have heard sometimes from NSOs that they say, well, we don't have to add them to this survey because we have them in another survey. No, you need to add them to every data collection where you want to disaggregate. It is not to get prevalence. Yeah, you only need to do one survey to get prevalence. But to do the disaggregation, you need to put them in the labor force survey, the living standards survey, the census, the health survey, the transportation survey, the education survey, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, we also developed a lot of aids for adoption. We have guidelines and documentation, translation, as we said, implementation guidelines, Q by Q specifications, interviewer guidelines, analysis guidelines with syntax in multiple languages. We have FAQs, blogs, trainings, webinars, videos. It is a very comprehensive website. Anything you want to know about the Washington Group, it's there. And if it's not, you tell us, we'll put it there. So there's a lot of work was done to provide the backbone so that these questions could be used. Next slide. And we have our regional groups. About, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we decided global was good, but some issues were at a regional level and could be best addressed at the regional level. And we could do a better job of building expertise. So these are the groups we have. 2 in Africa, in Buenos Aires in South Latin America, Casablanca for the ESQUA region, Pacific Group on Disability in the Pacific, and the Kathmandu group for South Asia. So we have these regional groups. They're all in different levels of where they need to be, but we view this group as maintaining expertise in the region in case somebody changes jobs or whatever, there's always a strong technical body within the region that can provide support and guidance. Next slide. So in session 10, we have to decide, where do we go from here? Where should the Washington Group put its efforts moving forward? What would you like us to be doing? What would you like all of us to be doing together? How can we best integrate members and projects without having in-person meetings? We will try to have an in-person meeting, but without funding, it becomes very difficult. We really need a country to host, to take on a lot of that responsibility. We will not have administrative support externally. If we could, we'd love to do it. But if we can't do it, how do we do it in a virtual environment? What do you as members need from the Secretariat? We will try to meet all your needs, but we need to know what they are. How do you want to be involved in Washington Group work? Where do you see yourself fitting? We are not asking most of the time for huge commitments of time. Sometimes it's very minimal commitment, but we would like everyone involved. We would like you to get involved in the work groups. Think about work groups if they don't exist, what you would like them to be. We will do our best as the Secretariat to organize all of that, but we can't run them, we can't do them, we need you, it's your group. What is missing from the materials that we've developed and posted on the website? What do you need? What can we do in terms of providing webinars? I mean, a lot of information was provided this morning on the CFMTV, more than I could kind of keep in mind. I know we're going to try to summarize across all the surveys, but should we have a webinar specifically about that, where we can really focus in on some of the findings for those members who are particularly interested in it? You'll hear on Wednesday about the psychosocial. We could have webinars on that. Those are not that hard to organize. So we need to hear from you what you want. I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure we're a little late. And Julie, I'll let you know. Oh, we're right on time. I lost my phone connection. You're calling me. Thank you. So if there are any questions, any comments that you want to make now, please do.
Thank you, Jennifer. Questions? Was this useful?
You're welcome.
I'm not seeing anything at the moment. I know it's been a long morning, afternoon. I'll turn it over to Cordell.
Yeah, so I want to thank all the presenters for today. There were some great presentations, and I especially enjoyed, hearing about the work on the child functioning module. I know everyone, in a hurry to get off to their next meeting or the rest of their day. So just think about, if you want to, have questions about some of the material that was covered today, you can take some time tonight, think about it. And, we're happy to answer questions tomorrow just about any of the material that we discussed today. And I just, everyone, I look forward to everyone, joining tomorrow to discuss the work on the inclusive education module, as well as the standard reports for disability reporting, and also just the work group breakout session. So I'm going to close the meeting for today. It's been great. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing and speaking with everyone tomorrow.